This is the gwolves HT-S2 Pro, an updated version of the original HT-S2 that improves upon the mouse's weight, specs, performance, and shaping. Now, I haven't used the original HT-S2, however I have used most of gwolves' recent releases, and compared to them this mouse is quite unique as it features a hybrid shaping, which while being symmetrical, is a mix of sorts between the HT-S Ultra and the HT-R Pro, featuring a traditionally shaped forward shell region, but with a very steep, almost ledge-like shaping at the mouse's rear region. In theory, this unique shape allows the mouse to fill a rather specialized niche in gwolves' lineup, as it's ideal for hybrid and fingertip grip styles, which makes the mouse's usage experience rather distinct compared to gwolves' other releases. And in typical gwolves style, the HT-S2 Pro, despite its unique shape, delivers extremely solid performance and a significantly improved weight compared to its predecessor, and in today's video we're going to take a deep dive into the mouse and discuss its features, performance, pros and cons, and much more. But before we get into it, if you enjoy the review and want to see more content like this, including a full teardown of the HT-S2 Pro and a review of the gwolves VUC, a mouse that has 2 sensors, leave a like on this video and get subscribed to the channel. And a big thank you to all of our channel members who support what I do here on the channel. If you would like to support what I do here on the channel and get early access to all upcoming content, consider becoming a channel member today. But without further ado, let's get right into today's episode of the mel0n Review. For testing parameters, I use the HT-S2 Pro for approximately 2 weeks, daily driving the mouse for both work and gaming use on various soft and hard pad types. For skates, I tested all the included types over my testing, but opted to use the stock full-size ones the most, as the mouse's compatibility with aftermarket skates is rather poor. And for firmware, the mouse was tested on version 1.0.39.0, the latest version available at the time of this review. For versions, the mouse currently comes in 3 colorways: Magala Purple, which has a black shell and purple buttons, All Black, which has a black shell with black buttons, and White, which has a white shell with green buttons. All these colorways retail for $159 USD, but if future colorways are released, they might be more expensive depending on the shell material and coloring, and today I'll be reviewing the white colorway of the HT-S2 Pro. For unboxing, as expected for a gwolves mouse, the HT-S2 Pro includes a boatload of accessories, giving this mouse and gwolves' other mice the best unboxing experience you'll find on the market. But before we talk about the accessories, I do have to yet again critique gwolves' packaging, as they continue to use AI-generated art for the box. I've critiqued this art choice every time I've covered one of their products, so I'm not going to dwell on this too much, but I do wish gwolves would use actual art or just plain packaging instead of this AI slop. But aside from the packaging art, the box itself is the same style as the ones that were used for gwolves' previous mice, but oddly, my product box lists the wrong specs on its side, as these are the specs for the HT-S2, not the Pro variant, even though the front of the box says HT-S2 Pro. I assume this was just a mistake with the packaging design, but this is something I wanted to point out regardless. Opening the box, inside we'll find the expected accessory package and a sheet of pre-cut modular grip tapes, as well as a gray carrying case, the same ones that were included with gwolves' other mice. Inside this case we'll find 2 USB-C cables, both of which are USB A to C types, but one is a thinner, more flexible cable while the other one is a thicker, more shielded, rigider cable. Both of these cables lack tilted USB-C ends, and their wired usage experience is interesting to say the least, but we'll talk more about their design and usage later. Next we have a semi-transparent cyan-colored AK dongle, the same type of dongle as the ones included with the Fenrir ASIM and Fenrir Max. This is a lighter style of dongle as it only weighs around 8.8 grams, but it does have a large grippy rubber base on it, which helps to keep the dongle well anchored despite its lighter weight, though it still can be displaced by heavier cables such as the included shielded cable. And the last item included in this gray carrying case is the mouse, which is wrapped in a fabric sleeve, which comes with 2 dots and a larger surface area base ski as its stock ski configuration. Next, let's talk about this accessory package we removed earlier, which includes a quick start guide listing the mouse's buttons, specs, and some support information. Next, we have a small package of skates, which includes a sheet of 30 PTFE dots and 2 sets of full-size PTFE skates. And as we see it included with other gwolves products, this mouse also includes 2 sheets of skate spacers, both in 1mm and 1.5mm sizes, which are a neat little accessory to include, and we'll talk more about the included skates performance and the usage of these spacers later in this video. Next, we have 2 sets of cover stickers, but unlike the ones included with gwolves' previous mice that covered the mouse's base entirely, these stickers are designed to cover the mouse's PCB only. As such, these will only protect the board from debris buildup, specifically on the battery pad's exposed adhesive, but they won't act as a barrier preventing debris from getting into the mouse's shell like the traditional base cover stickers we've seen include with their other mice. And because of this, I much would have rather seen them include a full base cover sticker here instead of these PCB ones. This accessory package also includes 2 extra adhesive pads for the mouse's battery, the same type as the ones included with gwolves' previous mice, and these are very useful as if you ever need to replace or mod the mouse's battery, you can use these pads instead of heavier double-sided tape to install said battery. That is everything for the in-box accessories, but as expected, the mouse does include an additional accessory package, which includes several additional items. The first of which is a pack of arm sleeves, which are a palm design, the same type as the ones included with gwolves' other mice. Now, while it is nice to see these included, they are a rougher type of sleeve, meaning they can be a little more controlled than you'd expect an arm sleeve to be, especially on fabric pads, though they do perform well on hard pads. But in the short term, these sleeves will do the trick until you can get a proper gaming optimized sleeve. Next, we have 4 packs of gwolves lightweight clay included with the mouse as well, which is one of the most underrated accessories included with gwolves mice, as you can use this clay to create shape altering attachments like a finger ridge, an L-shaped anchoring point, or even a hump cover that widens or raises the height of the mouse's hump. But since the instructions for this clay aren't the best, I did make a guide on how to properly use it, so if you want to learn more about this included clay and how to properly utilize it, you can check out my guide linked on screen here and down in the video description. Next, this extra accessory pack includes a resealable bag, which is designed to be used as a storage bag for the mouse. Now, gwolves has included these bags with all of their recent releases, as their more open shell designs can be rather susceptible to debris related issues, and they've included this storage bag to help prevent said issues. Now, you don't have to use this specific bag though, you can store the mouse in the product box, the included carrying case, or in an anti-static bag, but it's important to note that you can only store the HT-S2 Pro and all of gwolves' other mice for that matter in the listed methods, and I would recommend against using other kinds of resealable bags such as a Ziploc bag, as they can generate static electricity inside them which could damage your mouse. And lastly, for warranty, the mouse comes with a 1-year warranty, and you can find all the terms and conditions for said warranty over on gwolves' website. For in-game performance, the HT-S2 Pro, like most of gwolves' mice I've covered here before, was great overall. Sadly though, I wasn't able to utilize the mouse's hybrid shape as my hands were too large for it, so I had to use it as a fingertip mouse, but even in this use case, the mouse was still quite impressive given its size and its lightweight design. But as tradition for a gwolves product, the mouse's shell and buttons do not have any coating applied to them. As such, the mouse's honeycomb shell and buttons are just raw plastic, which is quite slippery and difficult to grip. But as we just talked about, gwolves does include a full set of their amazing grip tape with the mouse, which resolves the shell's gripability issues. However, to use the mouse, you will be fully reliant on grip aids. The mouse's specs are also great, being on par with most modern gaming mice, and as expected for a gwolves product, the buttons, sensor, and polling rates are all very well implemented, and just like the HTX Mini, the mouse also utilizes a forward sensor position, which further improves the mouse's performance once you get used to it, that is. But all that said, again, I felt like I wasn't using the mouse to its full potential as I couldn't utilize its hybrid shaping due to my hand size. Despite this though, the mouse overall was impressive, as gwolves has packed an insane amount of performance into this small lightweight shell, and over my testing time I performed very well with the HT-S2 Pro, and in all honesty there aren't many issues I have with the mouse, as overall it's very well designed. I do have some nitpicks of course, but overall it's very impressive. But again, for my hand size, this mouse doesn't make a lot of sense, as I can't properly utilize the shape as it was designed to be, so despite the mouse's great performance, I'd personally rather use the Fenrir Max of the HTX Mini, as I can properly utilize those shapes compared to the HT-S2 Pro, but I can see this shape being fantastic for people with smaller hands, as even though I wasn't using the ideal grip style for this mouse, I still performed very well on it, and I can only imagine how well the mouse will feel and perform with a more compatible hand size. As a preface to this segment, my unit was sent to me directly from gwolves, so take the overall build quality and QC of my unit with a grain of salt. Now, the build quality of my HT-S2 Pro is impressive, and despite the mouse's lightweight design, the shell is decently rigid. However, the rear region's walling is quite thin due to the weight optimizations done to the shell, and as such, the rear region can't flex when direct pressure is applied to it. The same applies to the rear hump, as just like the HTS Ultra, it can also flex if pressure is applied, but this flexing only occurs when I I put direct pressure on these areas, and over my testing I didn't notice any creaking or flexing issues, and overall the mouse's build quality given its weight is quite good. For QC, the unit is overall solid as the PCB soldering is good with no noticeable flaws, and as expected for a gwolves mouse, all the mouse's buttons are well implemented, though the side buttons are a little on the heavy side, and throughout my testing I didn't run into any functional issues with any aspect of the mouse. But I did want to point out one interesting aspect to the mouse's shell, as just like the HT-R Pro, this mouse supports a central stabilizer bar. However, gwolves opted not to include it as the main PCB provides ample support in the shell's mid to top region, and if it were included the bar would add unnecessary weight to the mouse. I also should mention that the mouse's shell, unlike the HT-S2, features a honeycomb design, which is largely hollow in an effort to reduce the mouse's weight, but this open, hollow honeycomb shell, as mentioned earlier, does make the mouse more susceptible to debris buildup, and the mouse's texturing can also be rather abrasive against your fingers if you grip it without any grip aids. As such, and due to the lack of a shell coating, I highly advise using the included grip aids as they make the shell much easier to grip and remove any textural issues you might experience with the mouse's shell, and I also highly advise using the included storage bag and cleaning the mouse frequently to prevent any debris related issues with the mouse given its open shell design. For weight, as mentioned earlier, the HT-S2 Pro is a more weight-optimized version of the already light HT-S2, as gwolves is advertising that the mouse weighs 28.4 grams, a pretty significant improvement from the 33.9 gram HT-S2. But as usual, they don't state any ratio on this spec, but seeing as the industry standard is plus minus 2 grams, I assume that'll apply here. Now in its stock configuration with the pre-installed stock skates, the mouse weighs 29.16 grams, with the full-size stock skates installed it weighs 29.57 grams, and without any skates the mouse weighs 28.64 grams. But seeing as the mouse lacks a coating, you'll need to use the included grip aids or aftermarket ones to grip the shell effectively, and these will add weight to the mouse's shell as the stock grips in their full-size form add around 2 grams, bringing the total stock weight to 31.16 grams, whereas the grips in their modular form only add around 0.40 grams, bringing the stock weight to 29.40 grams. So unlike many previous gwolves products I've covered here on the channel who weighed well above their advertised weight specs, the HT-S2 Pro falls within its advertised 28.4 plus minus 2 gram range in most configurations, the only exception being when you use the full-size grips which makes the mouse slightly heavier, but despite this is a great improvement here from gwolves as their weight specs are getting more accurate quote unquote. However, that said, I still would like to see gwolves advertise a plus minus gram ratio on their product pages, as advertising the mouse at 28.4 grams does not account for the weight added by full-size skates and the grip aids, and stating the industry standard plus minus 2 gram ratio on the mouse's product page would better reflect the mouse's true weight. But regardless, the overall weight of the HT-S2 Pro is impressive and considerable improvement from the HT-S2, and the mouse felt great to use due to its lightweight design, and hopefully we'll see gwolves continue to improve their advertised weights on their future products while having their mice weigh in this sub 30 gram range. For axis balancing, the HT-S2 Pro is centrally balanced, similar to how many of gwolves' other symmetrical mice have been balanced, being balanced at approximately the 56mm point of the mouse's x-axis. It is worth noting though there is a slight balancing range here, as the mouse feels balanced when gripped slightly forward or behind the physical midline and balancing point, within a range of approximately 4mm on both sides. However, grips outside of this area will cause the mouse to feel a little unbalanced. And for y-axis balancing, the mouse is centrally balanced on its y-axis with no bias to the mouse's left or right sides, as expected for a symmetrical shape. But seeing as the mouse utilizes a forward sensor position as mentioned earlier, which is located forward of the mouse's balancing range, the deviance between the sensor's location and the mouse's balancing can cause some inconsistencies at first, as the sensor's location is disjointed quote unquote from its balancing point. As such, the mouse will feel a little odd for a couple days as you acclimate to the mouse's balancing and sensor position, but once you get accustomed to it, this won't be an issue or a detriment to the mouse's performance, but keep in mind it'll take some time to get accustomed to the mouse's feel, especially if you're coming from a mouse with a more traditional balancing and sensor position. And as a final balancing related note here, in typical style for a gwolves mouse, since they're so weight optimized, they can be very easily unbalanced by cables, specifically thicker ones, so if you have to use the mouse while it's charging or are forced to use it wired, keep in mind that various stock cable types depending on their thickness and rigidity will unbalance the mouse and make it rather forward heavy. Now it's not as bad here on the HT-S2 Pro as it was on the Fenrir mice for example, but it is still a noticeable downside, so keep this in mind, and I'd recommend against using the mouse wired as much as possible, as the wired experience does feel pretty bad and quite unbalanced. For dimensions, the mouse measures 112mm long. For width, at the front region of the shell, at its top, the shell measures approximately 60.8mm wide, and at its base, it measures approximately 54.8mm wide. At the shell's mid region, at its top, the shell measures approximately 56.8mm wide, and at its base, it measures approximately 54.5mm wide. And lastly, at the shell's end region, at the base of the rounded rear hump, the shell measures approximately 61mm wide. And for height, at the shell's front region, the shell measures approximately 20.5mm tall. At the shell's mid region, it measures approximately 37.5mm tall. And from the peak of the shell's hump, this scales down to this little flare out towards the base, which measures approximately 2.1mm tall. For the mouse's shape, as I mentioned earlier, the HT-S2's Pro shell is quite unique compared to the other mice in gwolves lineup, as it's a hybrid of sorts between the HT-S Ultra and the HT-R Pro, giving the mouse quite distinct shell profiles. Now, compared to the original HT-S2, the shape is essentially identical with the exception of the rear hump's design, which is quite different, as instead of the HT-S2's traditional slope hump shaping, the hump here in the HT-S2 Pro is a steep ledge-like shape reminiscent of the rear hump shaping we saw in the HT-R Pro. But despite its uniqueness, the shape is still symmetrical and optimized for right-handed use, but due to its symmetrical nature, the mouse can be used ambidextrously, though left-handed users won't be able to utilize the side buttons. Now for the mouse's shell profiles, looking from the top we can see the mouse's symmetrical shape featuring a wider top and a semi-rounded rear region and a thinner mid region, and we can also see the unique rear hump shaping, but we'll get a better look at that in a moment. From the base we can clearly see just how pronounced the hourglass-like indentations in the shell are, and they are reminiscent of the side profile seen in the HTX Mini or a scaled-down HT-S Ultra, and at their deepest point these indentations roughly align with the middle of the mouse's balancing range. Looking from the sides, we can best see the aforementioned unique shape, as the forward shell region is the expected symmetrical design similar to a scaled down HT-S Ultra, but unlike many symmetrical mice whose hump peaks around the mouse's physical midline, the hump here on the HT-S2 Pro peaks behind the mouse's physical midline, then steeply tapers downward, creating the aforementioned ridge-like rear hump, which terminates at the stabilizing ledge at the base, the exact same rear shell profile we saw in the HT-R Pro. Looking from the front, we can see the forward region's rounded design with the slightly outwardly slanted main clicks, and we can also get the best view of the mouse's side shell profiles, which are quite aggressively inwardly tilted at the front region, which then even out slightly, then taper inward again at the shell's hourglass-like indentations, then even out again, then invert their shaping towards the rear region of the side shell to meld into the rear shell's profile. And lastly, looking from the rear, we can best see the mouse's rear hump profile, which aside from its steep ledge-like curvature, has the more prominent roundness at its top, creating a taller peak shaping than we traditionally see on many symmetrical mice. For contact areas for my 25.4 by 10.16cm hands using an angled fingertip grip here on the HT-S2 Pro. Starting off with thumb contact, my thumb naturally rests at the deepest part of the left side shell's hourglass indentation, directly below the side buttons, while my index and middle fingers rest towards the mid region of the main clicks, roughly aligned with the end region of the scroll wheel, and on the right side shell, my ring finger sits roughly opposite the position of my thumb, but it rests more towards the top of the right side shell's hourglass-like indentation, while my pinky finger rests below my ring finger towards the lower end of the aforementioned indentation. But if you have smaller hands that can use a claw or hybrid grip style here on the mouse, keep in mind that the really positioned hump will likely make contact with your mid-palm, thenar, and hypothenar regions of your hand, but the exact contact regions will vary depending on your hand size, but smaller hand sizes will be able to fully utilize the mouse's unique shaping, whereas larger handed users, like myself, can't also be forced to fingertip grip the mouse. For hand size and grip style compatibility for the HT-S2 Pro, as I mentioned earlier, the unique shape of the mouse makes it quite versatile, however certain hand sizes may encounter some compatibility issues with some grip styles. Now as mentioned earlier, the mouse is right hand optimized, but due to its symmetrical nature it can't be used with left-handed grip styles, however left-handed users won't be able to utilize the side buttons. Now for hands measuring approximately 15.2 to 16.5 by 8 to 9.5 centimeters, the mouse will be best suited for palm and claw grips. For hands measuring approximately 16.5 to 17.8 by 9.5 to 10.5 centimeters, the mouse will be best suited for palm and claw grips. For hands measuring approximately 17.8 to 19.1 by 10.5 to 11.5 centimeters, the mouse will be best suited for claw and fingertip grips, whereas for hands measuring approximately 19.1 to 20.3 by 11.5 to 12.5 centimeters, the mouse will be best suited for claw and fingertip grips again. And lastly, for hands measuring approximately 20.3 to 21.6 by 12.5 to 13.5 5cm, the mouse will be best suited for fingertip grips only. But keep in mind that these are rough estimates and the actual hand size and grip style compatibility for this mouse will vary from person to person, so if you're considering getting the HT-S2 Pro, I'd recommend measuring the length of your hands from the tip of your middle finger to just below your wrist line, and the width of your hand by measuring your knuckles, excluding your thumb, and you can use those measurements to determine if your hand size and your grip style will be compatible here with the HT-S2 Pro. As mentioned earlier, the HT-S2 Pro includes a sheet of gwolves' fantastic grip type, which like their previous releases comes in a modular form and includes 2 sets of side button covers, a hump cover, and several universal pieces that can be used for point coverage or on other devices. And just like the previous gwolves stock grips we've talked about here on the channel before, these grips share the same raised hexagonal texturing, sticky material, and thicker form factor, which unsurprisingly gives these grips exceptional performance with both wet and dry hands, and their thicker form factor gives these grips exceptional durability and performance over long-term use. The thicker nature of these grips also allows them to be quite reusable, as they won't warp or tear like thinner grips do when removed, allowing you to adjust their position or move them from mouse to mouse without damaging them. And since these grips are modular, unlike traditional full-size grips, you can only install the modular pieces you need, resulting in less weight being added to the mouse overall compared to traditional full-size grips. And over my testing, as expected for these grips, they performed exceptionally well and made the mouse much easier to grip compared to its uncoated shell, and the only issue quote-unquote I have with these grips is that their thicker design does cause them to have a bit of a noticeable edge to them, and they do widen the mouse's width a little bit, but these are very minimal nitpicks, and overall these included grips are arguably the best included grips you'll find on the market. But if you dislike their thicker design or their surface texturing, you can always use aftermarket grips like the X-Ray Cicada Wings or Geckos, as both of those options perform similar to these stock grips but in a thinner form factor with less texturing. However, it's worth noting that if you plan on using any aftermarket grips on any gwolves mice with this honeycomb texture, keep in mind that thinner grips will be less effective at hiding the shell's texturing, and this is why these stock grips are so thick, as gwolves has designed them to hide the shell's texture. So keep this in mind if you plan on using aftermarket grip aids here on the HT-S2 Pro or any of gwolves' other products for that matter, and make sure you get thicker types for the best experience. For main clicks, the HT-S2 Pro has a fairly standard implementation, but uniquely the mouse uses a new switch type we haven't seen gwolves use before. But before we talk about them, let's talk about the main buttons themselves. Now the shell buttons here are a longer design, similar to the design of the HTX Mini's main clicks, which are ever so slightly rounded to match the forward shell's profile, and as mentioned earlier, the buttons also have a slanted shaping, being the tallest towards the middle of the shell and slanting downwards towards the sides. Interestingly though, the shell buttons have the same split texturing we saw in the HTR Pro's main clicks, as the end to mid region of the buttons are solid plastic, while the top region is honeycomb. This is a great thing to see here actually, as this honeycomb texturing can be a little abrasive against fingers, specifically on the shell buttons as we've seen on many of gwolves' previous mice. So having the split texturing on the main clicks here prevents any textural issues entirely, even if you opt against using the included grip aids on the main clicks. The shell buttons also have a very slight convex grooving in them, which runs from the end to mid region of the buttons, but since the indentation is so slight, they don't do much in terms of guiding your fingers, but they do slightly aid in counteracting the button's tilted design, allowing for a slightly more flattened surface area. But just like the rest of the mouse's shell, the main buttons lack a coating, which makes the main clicks rather slippery, especially if you have sweatier hands. Thankfully, like the rest of the shell though, you can resolve this by using the included grip aids or aftermarket ones, as grip aids drastically improve the button's gripability and makes them much easier to utilize. I also wanted to highlight that the main clicks are indented into the mouse's shell, which keeps the clicks free of any interference issues caused by fingers resting against the mouse's side shell, which is a very important feature on a mouse optimized for hybrid or fingertip grip styles. For click heights, since the shell is symmetrical, both the main buttons share the same click heights, as at their end region the buttons measure approximately 16mm tall, at their mid region they measure approximately 23.1mm tall, and at their top region they measure approximately 29.2mm tall. In terms of main click audio feedback, here's a quick sound test of the HT-S2 Pro's main clicks. Now, as I alluded to earlier, the HT-S2 Pro uses a new switch type for its main clicks, as instead of using mel0n or Wano blue shell pink dot switches as gwolves has used on their previous releases, instead they've opted to use Wano green shell white dot switches here. Now, while these switches are obviously a different SKU from the Wano blue shell pink dot switches, these two switches actually feel very similar, but the green shell switches do have a higher cycle rating, as they're rated for 100 million cycles instead of 80 million cycles, which is the rating for the blue shell variant. For click feel, unsurprisingly surprisingly, these switches feel nearly identical to the blue shell variants, having an actuation weight of around 65 grams. Now technically speaking, these switches are heavier quote unquote than the blue shell pink dots, which are rated for a 60 gram actuation weight, but when compared to the HT-S Ultra, which uses the Wando blue shell pink dot switches, the main click's actuation weight feels essentially identical to the ones here on the HT-S2 Pro. But as expected, the actuation weight of the main clicks will change slightly depending on where you physically actuate the main buttons, as towards the button's end to mid regions, the clicks have the aforementioned 65 gram actuation weight, while at the top region the clicks will be heavier, being around the 75 gram range. For stabilization, to gwolves' credit, the main clicks are very well stabilized, with the only degree of play on the buttons happening when you fully actuate them, and the buttons' travel ranges are also quite good, as they have a very low degree of pre-travel and a low to medium range of post-travel, falling into the low range on lighter actuations and the medium range on heavier ones, and both the main clicks also have a very snappy rebound to them, and this combined with the travel ranges makes the main clicks quite spammable, and the rebound counteracts any negatives of the longer post-travel found when firmly pressing the main clicks. But while the main clicks are overall well implemented, one aspect that could be improved on them is the button's design, as just like many of gwolves' previous mice, the shell buttons do protrude from the front of the shell by a few millimeters. While this is admittedly a niche issue, it makes the buttons more susceptible to accidental damage, as if the front of the mouse is hit against anything during use, the main clicks will be the primary contact point, not the shell's framing, which can potentially lead to damage. Now this is obviously a niche issue, but it is something I wanted to mention regardless, and hopefully on future gwolves models they'll have more recessed main clicks to ensure they're less prone to potential damage. For side buttons, the HT-S2 Pro is using a familiar side button design, as their shaping is nearly identical to the side buttons we've seen on gwolves' other mice, specifically the HTX Mini, as the side buttons are the same wider, rounded, pill-like design that are angled forward to match the top shell's profile. These buttons, as mentioned earlier, are also centrally positioned in the mouse's shell, being positioned slightly forward of the mouse's physical midline and balancing point, centered at roughly the 58mm mark, which makes them very easy to actuate as the side shell's profile guides your thumb to rest directly below the middle of the side buttons. Now, one common gripe I usually have with gwolves side buttons is that they're often quite shallow, which has made them difficult to utilize in some of their previous releases. But thankfully, the side buttons here are quite pronounced, which makes the side buttons much easier to actuate, but just like the main clicks and the rest of the shell, the side buttons lack a coating, so despite their improved design, they are still rather slippery and can be difficult to actuate in some cases. But this issue can be resolved by using one of the included click cover sets, which not only makes the buttons much grippier, they also increase the height of the side buttons due to the grip's thickness, increasing their pronouncedness, which further improves their usability. However, while there is a gapping between the side buttons here, it's quite thin, meaning that it's very easy to actuate the opposite side button if you click the buttons towards their inner edges, specifically if you have larger fingers like myself. But due to the mouse's size, the only way this could be addressed would be make the side buttons smaller, which would negatively impact their usage in my opinion, so I'm going to give gwolves a pass about this aspect of the side buttons, but keep in mind about this gapping and make sure to actuate the buttons towards their top to mid regions, not their end regions, to prevent any accidental actuations. In terms of audio feedback, here is a quick sound test of the HT-S2 Pro's side buttons. Inside, the HT-S2 Pro is using a familiar side button switch, the TTC brown shell blue dot micro switches, the same switch type that was used on the HT-S Ultra's side buttons and a few of gwolves' other mice. For cycle rating, these switches are rated for around 3 million cycles, and they're rated for a heavier 70 to 75 gram actuation weight, which does make the side buttons noticeably heavier than the main clicks, but not to a degree that negatively impacts the mouse's performance. But one odd aspect to these side buttons is that initially these buttons were quite stiff, but over my testing they loosened up, hence the actuation weight range I just mentioned. And after a week or so of use, the side buttons kind of worked themselves in and matched the feel of the HT-S Ultra's side buttons after a little bit of use. For stabilization, the side buttons here are very well anchored and tensioned, with only a slight degree of play when fully actuated, and there's no noticeable wobbling to either of the side buttons, which is great to see. In terms of travel, both the side buttons have a low degree of pre-travel and a low to medium degree of post-travel, being in the low range with lighter actuations and more around the medium range with heavier ones, but most most of the time, like the main clicks, the side buttons fell more into the low range in terms of travel. Another great feature here is that the side buttons do have a surprisingly snappy rebound to them, which allows the side buttons to be decently spammable despite their longer travel ranges in some situations. Now, while the side buttons themselves are well implemented for the most part, I do think gwolves could have lightened the side buttons a little bit more, as in their current form they do feel a little unbalanced from the main clicks, and if the side buttons were to be lightened slightly, I think it would make the mouse feel a little more balanced in terms of its click implementations, but this is a very minimal nitpick overall, and the side buttons are very well implemented. For a scroll wheel, the HT-S2 Pro is using a familiar style of wheel, the same type we see used on the HT-S Ultra and several of gwolves' other mice. Now the wheel itself is a plastic wheel with a rubber texturing wrapped around it, which has a flattened linear dotted texturing which is quite grippable and makes utilizing the scroll wheel very easy. However, the wheel itself, like many of gwolves' previous scroll wheels, is rather shallowly positioned in the mouse's shell, and while it's better than many other gwolves' mice, it is on the shallower end compared to other brand symmetrical mice. Thankfully, this didn't significantly impact the mouse's usage from my testing, however you might notice that shallowness might affect the wheel's scroll range in some situations. Inside the mouse it is using yet another familiar component, as it's using a TTC 9mm gold dustproof 24-step encoder, the exact same encoder used on the HT-S Ultra, just a shorter skew. And unsurprisingly, the wheel here feels pretty much identical to the one in the HT-S Ultra, having the same medium strength scroll with semi-pronounced scroll points, which while not being the most pronounced are enough to keep the wheel controllable, so much so I didn't have any issues with over-scrolling or accidentally inputting scrolls when scroll wheel clicking, but keep in mind the more controlled nature of this encoder won't last forever, as these TTC encoders get very loose over long-term use. You won't notice any issues with the encoder for probably quite a while, but keep in mind overuse it will slowly loosen up. Lastly, for the wheel's click, the mouse is using another familiar component, as inside we'll find a small TTC pillar switch, which is the same type that was used on the HTX Mini. This switch is just a taller skew. Now, as expected for a pillar switch, the feeling of the click is spongy at best, with a heavier actuation weight of around 85 grams, and while the switch has essentially no pre-travel, it has a lot of post-travel, more around the medium range I'd say, which when combined with the weaker rebound gives the switch that aforementioned spongy feel, but this is to be expected as every mouse that uses a pillar switch for its wheel click feels like this, so this isn't an issue per se, but if you want to utilize the mouse's wheel click a lot and care about a snappier, more tactile feel, keep this in mind. For sensor, the HT-S2 Pro uses the expected Pixar 3950 series sensor, specifically the PA 3950 DMT5QU SKU, the same SKU we've seen used in many of gwolves' recent releases. As I mentioned earlier, this sensor is positioned forward in the mouse's shell, sitting about 7mm forward of the mouse's physical midline and balancing point, roughly at the 61mm mark on the mouse's x-axis. Now it's worth noting that the previous HT-S2 also utilized a forward sensor position, but the sensor here on the HT-S2 Pro is positioned farther from the mouse's physical midline than it was on the HT-S2 by a few millimeters. This forward sensor position, as I mentioned earlier, gives the mouse that snappier, faster feel you'll find on any mouse that utilizes a forward sensor, but as mentioned earlier, the mouse is centrally balanced, not balanced to the sensor's location. As such, this differential will create a slight disjointed feeling at first, and will require a few days of usage to get accustomed to it, but once you get used to it, the sensor feels great to use, and its forward position works really well here on the HT-S2 Pro. Now in terms of the sensor specs, this is the traditional 3950 SKU featuring a DPI range of 50 to 30,000, which is adjustable via 50 DPI steps, an IPS rating of 750, and an acceleration rating of 70 grams. The sensor also supports the expected 0.7, 1, and 2mm LOD levels, as well as motion sync, ripple, and angle snapping, and since this is a 3950 series sensor, it also supports on-device sensor tilting, allowing you to freely adjust the angle of the sensor by 33 degrees both positively and negatively. Now for the MCU, just like every other gwolves mouse I've covered recently, this mouse uses the same Nordic NRF 52840 MCU, and as expected, this is a very well implemented MCU. However, I would have loved to see gwolves update the MCU to the new NRF 52H20, as that SoC is significantly more power efficient, and we've seen Razer and a couple other brands adopt this new MCU to great success, and while it is disappointing not to see the new MCU here, the current implementation is fine by all means, but hopefully we'll see the new SoC used on gwolves' future releases. For connectivity, the HT-S2 Pro supports two modes, wired and wireless, and in the wireless connectivity mode, the mouse supports 125Hz to 8000Hz, while in the wired connectivity mode, it only supports 125 to 1000Hz. Admittedly, the lack of high polling rates on the wired connectivity is disappointing, however, seeing as this mouse is obviously optimized for wireless use, the lack of wired high polling rate support is understandable, though still disappointing. But as expected for a gwolves mouse, both the wired and wireless connectivity and their respective polling rates were perfectly implemented, and throughout my testing I didn't encounter any issues with the mouse's connectivity or polling rates, which is arguably to be expected for gwolves at this point, as their implementations have been flawless here and on all of their previous releases. For battery, the HT-2S Pro uses the same 250 mAh battery we've seen used on the HT-S Ultra and the HT-X Mini, which utilizes a 2mm JST PH 3-pin connector. Oddly enough though, gwolves isn't advertising any estimated runtimes here as they've done for the previous releases, and unfortunately I was unable to get an accurate reading of the mouse's runtimes as the WebDriver is still reporting incorrect battery levels, which is quite frustrating as this has been an issue I've run into with most of gwolves' recent releases. On the plus side though, since the mouse's specs are essentially the same as the HT-S Ultra, I assume that the HT-2S Pro's battery life will be similar, being roughly 68 hours on 1kHz, around 41 hours on 2kHz, 38 hours on 4kHz, and 27 hours on 8kHz. But keep in mind these values likely have a degree of error to them as the software reported the incorrect values when I reviewed the HT-S Ultra as well, and also note that utilizing the mouse's competitive mode will significantly decrease the mouse's runtime on all their respective report rates. Hopefully on gwolves' future releases, gwolves can address the reporting issue with their WebDriver, and while this doesn't significantly impact the mouse's day-to-day usage, having accurate readings in the WebDriver would be a welcome improvement. And for charging, the mouse charges via its front-facing USB-C port, which sits flush with the front end of the mouse's shell, allowing the mouse to be compatible with all types of USB-C cables, which is great to see, as the stock ones are interesting when it comes to their wired use case. So if you want to use aftermarket cables to improve the mouse's wired use, you can do so without running into compatibility issues. For software, the HT-S2 Pro uses gwolves' web-based software, the same version they've used for all of their recent releases, which is great to see as gwolves' software is pretty good for the most part, and I'll have the links to the WebDriver down in the video description for you all. Now the software has a single page layout with multiple tabs, each serving a single purpose, as in the DPI tab you can adjust the mouse's DPI levels and set the number of onboard profiles. You can also customize the mouse's lighting or disable it entirely. Under the key settings tab you can rebind all the keys on the mouse if needed. Sadly, there is no option to rebind a key to swap between the mouse's profiles, so if you do end up utilizing multiple profiles here, you'll need to swap through them via the driver. Under the parameters tab, you can adjust the mouse's debounce for the main clicks and scroll wheel, adjust the mouse's polling rate, enable or disable angle snapping and ripple, and set the mouse's auto sleep timer, but by default this menu doesn't show all these options and you need to expand it by clicking this arrow in the top right corner, and that will open the menu and show all these hidden options. This mouse also supports the same competitive mode we've seen on gwolves' other releases, which you can utilize to, technically speaking, increase the mouse's performance. However, it will significantly increase the mouse's power draw, which kind of nullifies its benefits, and from my experience you'd be much better off utilizing the mouse's high polling rates, but if we want to utilize this feature it is available here on the H2S Pro. But overall, just as we've seen on gwolves' other mice, their WebDriver is quite good, and the only things I'd like to see improved would be the option of adding a profile toggle or swap bind option to the key's rebind settings, and I'd like to see gwolves address the battery percentage issues as the software often reports the wrong levels, but overall the WebDriver is well implemented and hopefully we'll see gwolves continue to improve it on their future releases. For repairability, the HT-S2 Pro, like many of gwolves' mice, is a little unusual in this aspect, as while the unit is serviceable, it is somewhat complicated to take apart, similar to the HT-R Pro, but despite this, the mouse is serviceable, it's just harder to disassemble than some of gwolves' previous releases, but once you get it apart, you can access and service pretty much every component on the mouse, just as you could on gwolves' previous models. And as I mentioned earlier, the mouse also includes two extra battery adhesive strips, so if you want to mod out the 250 mAh battery for a larger or a smaller one, you can do this easily with these pads and re-anchor it to the PCB. However, doing so will affect the mouse's balancing depending on the battery's weight and dimensions, so keep that in mind. But overall, while the unit is a little complex, it is serviceable, and if you want to learn more about how to service this mouse yourself, see how it's designed on the inside, or learn more about the mouse's modding options, be sure to get subscribed so you don't miss the HT-S2 Pro's teardown video. For stock skates, as I mentioned earlier, the HT-S2 Pro comes with some pre-installed skates and several alternative options. Now during my testing I tested every type of the included skates, but opted to use the extra full-size ones for the majority of my testing as they perform the best out of the stock options. However, due to their PTFE nature, these skates are not ideal for hard pad usage as they wear extremely quickly. I did attempt to use some aftermarket skates, but sadly the mouse's skate compatibility is quite poor despite the mouse's base being completely flat, as the small skate installation areas means the mouse is only compatible with aftermarket 6.5mm or smaller dot skates. So keep this in mind if you plan on using this mouse on a hard pad that will need hard pad optimized skates or with other alternative skate types. I also wanted to mention that the base skate on the mouse is quite unique here, as you can remove these tiny dots inside it to decrease the skate's surface area. So if you feel like the base skate is dragging too much, you can remove these little dots as needed, which is a really cool feature. And as I mentioned earlier in this video, the mouse includes 2 sheets of foam spacers. Both sheets include 30 pads, but they differ in heights, as one set is 1mm tall and the other is 1.5mm tall. And both sets of these spacers share the same widths, as they measure approximately 6mm wide. Now these pads are similar in concept to the layers of SMPF foam we find in X-Ray Pad's Air series skates, as they are designed to sit under the mouse's skates to act as a buffering layer. But since the material of these spacers is harder than the SMPF foam, they're not as effective as reducing audio and physical feedback from the skates as a real SMPF layer would be, but what it does do very well is it's better at raising the height of the skates, as its harder material doesn't compress as much as the softer SMPF material does. Now gwolves says these are included to accommodate higher LOD levels, which makes sense considering their stock skates are so small, but in my opinion they're more effective at raising the skates so they are taller, helping to avoid bottoming out issues when using the dot skates on softer pad types. But aside from these spacers, while the mouse's stock skates are decent overall, one improvement I would have liked to see is the inclusion of some kind of optional skate platform. This platform could have been anchored into the sides of the mouse using the existing screw holes to add an area to the center of the shell where skates could be installed, and this would add a little more stabilization to the mouse and provide more installation area for additional types of aftermarket skates. But this is a very minimal nitpick, and overall the mouse's stock skates are good. Obviously the full-size ones are much better than the included dots in my opinion, but the skates themselves are fine, and the only area I really think gwolves could improve on this mouse would be the skate installation area, as the mouse isn't compatible with any kind of aftermarket skate that isn't a dot, and hopefully this limitation can be addressed on a future version of the HT-S2 Pro. Alright, and lastly let's talk about cables. Now as I mentioned earlier, just like all of gwolves' other releases, the HT-S2 Pro includes 2 types of stock cables. The first cable is a standard USB A to C cable, but it is a thicker, more rigid type with a lot of shielding, and has a semi-rough paracord wrapping. This cable is very similar to the average stock cable you'd find included with a typical gaming mouse. While the second cable is also USB A to C cable, but it's a much thinner, more flexible cable with a smoother paracord wrapping. And both perform the same, as the only real difference between them is that the thinner cable is much more flexible than the thicker, rigider one, but aside from this difference I didn't run into any issues using any of them over my testing, but due to their non-tilted USB-C end and their design I would not recommend using them for wired use, as you'd be much better off using aftermarket cables. That said though, I would normally critique these included cables for being less than ideal for wired use. However, since this mouse is not designed to be a wired mouse, nor does it support polling rates over 1000 Hz on its wired connectivity, I'm going to give gwolves a pass here. However, as I mentioned earlier and as we've seen on gwolves mice before, if you use the mouse wired it will feel very front heavy because the mouse is so light, and the cable's weight will unbalance it, so keep this in mind if you have to use the mouse while it's charging, as any cable type will make the mouse forward heavy to varying degrees depending on the cable's thickness and its rigidity. Alright, well in closing, overall the HT-S2 Pro is another solid release from gwolves, and while I wasn't able to fully utilize the mouse's unique hybrid shell, I can definitely see this mouse being one of gwolves' more popular releases, as it's pretty much perfect, specifically when it comes to performance. I do of course have a couple nitpicks though, the biggest being the side buttons being a little on the heavy side and the software's battery issues, as well as the mouse's poor skate compatibility, but these are pretty minimal issues in all honesty, and again, while I really couldn't utilize this mouse to its full potential, I still think it's a very solid mouse overall. But that said, while the current iteration is a great mouse, I would love to see gwolves make a larger version of this mouse, as a larger iteration of this hybrid shape would be amazing for larger handed folk like myself, and with a bigger shape I'd be able to much better utilize this hybrid shaping, and hopefully we'll see gwolves explore making a larger version in the future. But for now, if you have small to medium sized hands and use a hybrid or claw grip style, the HT-2S Pro is probably one of the best mice in gwolves lineup for that hand size and grip style, but if you have larger hands like like myself, you'll be better off getting more grip optimized mice such as the Fenrir Max for fingertip grip or the HT-S Ultra for claw grips. But with that, that's everything for today's episode of the mel0n Review. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video and want to see more like this, be sure to leave a like and get subscribed to the channel, and keep an eye out for the HT-S2 Pro's teardown video and gwolves VOC review, which will be releasing very soon. And if you'd like to support my efforts here on the channel with these in-depth reviews, the teardown project, and everything else I do here, consider becoming a channel member here on YouTube, as that is one of the best ways to directly support the channel, and being a channel member also gives you early access to all upcoming content. So if you'd like to support me and get early access to all upcoming content, become a channel member today. And with that, thank you for watching my review of the gwolves HT-S2 Pro, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the mel0n Review. Peace.